It is time for us to begin this evening. I won't look down to the microphone the whole time, so that'll help a little bit there. If you have a Bible handy, I'm going to ask you to be turning to the book of Hebrews. It's not an accident. The book of Hebrews to begin this evening. We're grateful that you're here. Look forward to a time of study together this evening in the middle of our week here. Encourage one another with study of God's Word and also a little bit of fellowship and catching up with each other. You know, we'll pick on Ricky for a while, but as he said on Sunday morning, it's good to hear the noise, good to hear everybody talking and visiting before, and have a chance to study too, but then get back to visiting when we're done in just a little bit. The reason I ask you to turn to Hebrews, you can turn to Hebrews chapter 6, is because I'd like tonight to spend the first couple of minutes touching on some of the questions that I got Sunday morning, just because I'd mentioned, but I had two lessons now where we are tonight, where we are as of this evening. I've got two lessons left on Ecclesiastes in 3 weeks. And really, I noticed in my study over the last week for tonight that the author kind of basically that I've been using as main source material kind of skipped over chapter 10 of Ecclesiastes. And there's a decent reason why. We'll talk about just a little bit. We're going to look at chapter 10, but it's not in the same vein of some of the same things we've been looking at. It's a little different, and so I thought, well, we'll do that. We'll see how far we can get. But I mentioned Sunday night that I had gotten or Sunday morning, one or the other, that I'd gotten two questions between service and class on Sunday morning about Bible class, and then I ended up getting a third question by the time that the day was over. And so tonight I'd like for us to begin in talking about those, but I have to make a deal with you. I want to touch on them, but we can't spend all night on them, all right? I don't want to rehash the whole lesson. I want to get to a little bit of Ecclesiastes, so we'll try to do that. But we started on Sunday morning talking about the rest of the Sermon on the Mount, where we had gotten to in Matthew chapter 5, and we said that we need to be careful what we think, and we think about what's in our heart and that kind of idea. Well, 3 questions came up in particular. I want to share them in pretty much the wording that they came to me, and then make a few comments, and then we'll try to get on to our Ecclesiastes. The first one dealt with the section in Matthew chapter 5 where we talked about taking oaths, and really we use the word swearing. And we mentioned how a lot of people get a little confused here. People who are not as familiar with the text or haven't looked at it as closely, but they think they see that the Bible says that you shouldn't swear, and some of them will take that to mean, we say 4-letter words, swear words, and while it's true that we have to learn to control our tongue and we need to be careful what we say, that's not what that is saying there, but it's talking about taking oaths. And so we mentioned for just a moment, and the reason I want to go back over these a little bit more detail was because I was kind of having to hit the highlights and hit the just a little bit of it, and then some more questions came up. So the question in general was, is it okay for a Christian to swear? And the idea of put your hand on the Bible, raise your right hand, repeat after me, swear in court, take an oath in court to tell the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth. I don't even know what they say today. It may have changed a little bit. The question that came to me came with the idea that apparently, and in doing a little research, some of you may have known this, but you can actually affirm and not say that you swear. And is that better or worse? Is that something that that we need to make note of, that Christians should do? You shouldn't swear in court. You shouldn't take that oath, but you can affirm. Well, notice with me first of all here in Hebrews chapter 6, verses 13 through 18, for the point of our mentioning this particular question. As you read that, you'll notice God made an oath. God made a promise. In verse number 13, the New King James says, "For when God made a promise to Abraham, because he could swear." There's our words. God made an oath. And we can see in other passages of the New Testament, in other places in the Bible, it's not a sin to sort of make an oath or to make a pledge. We won't take the time to go back to Matthew with each of these, but in Matthew they're talking about the fact that they were making oaths by a lot of different things, not just in the name of God, but by Jerusalem or by the temple or by all these other things. And they were trying to get out of doing that. Well, I didn't swear it by God, I swore it by Jerusalem, so I can not hold up my end of the bargain or keep my word. And what was Jesus' response to that? Let your yes be yes, let your no be no. So the answer that I had on Sunday morning for this was, and the answer that was given in the material I was using, I kind of liked the way he said it, was there may be times as Christians that we make, and I don't know if this is the best word even, but a concession for the sake of the world or for the sake of others. Now, I don't mean that you sin. I don't mean that you give in on something that God has said we must do. In fact, we talked about that maybe last week for just a moment about not, obeying the government up until the point that it goes against the Word of God. So I'm not saying we should concede that and go against what God has said, but the people in the court may not even know who you are. They don't know you're a Christian. They don't know that your yes means yes and your no means no. And so for the sake of the court, for the sake of your testimony, I personally, feel that it would be okay for you to do that so that you can give a testimony that what you're saying is true to this court, especially maybe a court of people that you don't even know. You're just confirming what is already true when you do that you're telling the truth. And again, in front of people possibly that don't know you. Now, to the question there at the bottom, should we affirm instead? I might ask, could we affirm instead? I mean, if your conscience if you would feel better by saying that, it seems to me in my brief little bit of research that you can either ask or do that, and that's okay. It's acceptable to the court, maybe to the judge. So I don't think you have to. It has to be something you have to worry about. But for the sake of your conscience, if it's something that you would rather affirm and the court approves that, it's okay. And again, not conceding for the sake of going against God, conceding for the sake of the world, and that you're just simply confirming the manner in which you're already going to testify in that particular instance. Brady?
I mean, it's the same thing.
Yeah.
You're promising to tell the truth.
Yeah.
And of course, we know, I don't know how many shows I've seen where somebody pulled over, said, I smell marijuana. Is any marijuana in that car? I swear on my dead grandmama.
Yeah.
And so we're supposed to carry.
Yeah. And I turned over there real quick, but it says, Jesus says, neither by heaven, by earth, by Jerusalem, nor by the city of the great king, or for is the city of the great king. So yeah, I swear on my family's name. I swear on my mama's grave. You're getting away from that and being a person who can't be trusted, and you're simply confirming that you are a truth teller, that your yes is yes and your no is no.
But if a person does not feel comfortable and it would be violate their conscience to so do, then don't violate your conscience.
Yeah, then don't violate your conscience, sure. Yeah. Real quick, turn back to Matthew chapter 5. I don't have any other parallel or confirming passages for these next two questions, but Matthew chapter 5 is where we were. We began Sunday morning in Matthew chapter 5, verses 21 through 26, and we were talking about murder, and we were talking about the idea of murder beginning in the heart, that, besides accidents, you don't just, accidentally shoot someone in the sense of an argument's occurring, that kind of thing. Sure, there's accidental gunshots. I don't mean that. But a lot of times you don't take somebody's life unless, there's something beyond that. There's some kind of anger or hate that's been a part of that. And so the question that came up with the idea of murder was, is it okay, and again, I'm paraphrasing for the sake of questions tonight, for a Christian to serve in the military, or more maybe directly, a person who might have to carry out orders? And I kind of shortened it to say, as a part of that, might be, have to kill someone. Now, we know that military service has changed a lot. We know that, maybe even not necessarily military service, but battle, warfare, right? We're not lining up, 100 on one side and 100 on the other side with guns pointing at each other in the same way in military battle now as they did once upon a time. But Freddie talked about this even 2 weeks ago or a week and a half ago when he first started this material. But he pointed out that the 10 Commandments, we usually say, thou shalt not kill, but it literally means do no murder. That's the point there. And murder is the taking, the killing, intentional, we would probably even add, intentional killing of an innocent life. And so that's where we, of course, sometimes probably in our court system get into different degrees, right? Because a person maybe be involved in an accident and it's truly an accident, but the other person passes away and they were not intentionally taking someone else's life. They were not trying to murder them. And when we talk about Christians and military service, there is a whole lot involved there, especially, I've heard preachers who are former members of the military who said, I would suggest now that a person never do that. It can just be, we might say, use the phrase playing with fire, in the sense of, I read an article, one of the articles I found online was a person who was saying, you can be a Christian in the military, but you better be a strong Christian when you go in, because a lot of the things that are involved in being in the military are going to do its best to take that out of you, to tell you that, foul language all the time is fine, or all these other things, compromises, or going out drinking with the guys is fine, or all these things. So that's kind of a separate thing here. But just because a person might have served in the military and might have even had to been involved in carrying out orders. We don't have time tonight to talk about all the passages in the New Testament that mention that the government is a steward, almost literally a deacon of God. The government is that. God uses it as a servant, as a steward, to carry out his will or for things to be done. And so, I would never suggest that someone should be scared or afraid or embarrassed or was sinning for serving their country. Because we're not talking about the same things. We're talking about hating someone or murder in that kind of way.
And also, obviously, in that same question, if a Christian can't be in the military, they can't be a cop.
Sure, they can't be a phrase says they can't be a cop. And in fact, I found an article or a lectureship book. I think it's by Don Blackwell, or at least this article wasn't him. And the question there was, well, what's the difference in God's law? This will really, I'll have to leave you with this. But what's the difference in God's law for Christians and non-Christians? Is there any difference? Does God expect non-Christians to do something different? Well, it's okay for a non-Christian cop to shoot and kill somebody, but it's not okay for a Christian. No, he doesn't want anybody to have to do that, or to do that out of murder or hate or that kind of thing. God wants non-Christians to be Christians, to live by the same law. There's no difference. So to Freddie's point, if it's not good for a Christian to be in the military, it shouldn't be a police officer either. And if Christians shouldn't do it, then non-Christians shouldn't do it. God doesn't desire for heathen people to do all the evil things, because it's not necessarily evil in of itself.
You can take it to an
Sure.
extreme. You can say, okay, everybody in the United States of America is a Christian.
Yeah.
And a faithful Christian. And we don't believe it's right
Yeah.
to be in the military or shoot somebody, even though they deserve it.
Yeah.
And so, how easy it's going to be to take you over.
Yeah.
By evil.
By evil, for sure, which is something we've been talking a lot about lately in the world. Evil in the world, evil things.
Consistency argument, that's always where I go. I mean, here Jesus defended himself on numerous occasions. Paul did as well. So if I'm authorized by following the Lord and Paul's example to defend myself, then I certainly have the ability to defend my family. If I have the ability to defend my family, I have the ability to defend the city of Dunlop and the state of the United
Sure.
States of America.
And so real quick, the third question along the lines of that was from the section at the end that we really got to spend a little time on, very little time, because class was running out. But in particular, the idea of turning the other cheek. Remember that we mentioned that beginning in verse number 38, if you're still there in Matthew chapter 5, beginning in verse 38, there's the eye for the eye, tooth for a tooth. There is the tunic, verse 39, there is the slapping of the cheek. Verse 40, there's the tunic. Verse 41, there's the rule of going the extra mile. And in verse 42, there's the idea of your clothing or your things that belong to you. And really, this, back to what Ricky and Freddie were kind of saying, this question kind of came up as well with this is, well, I'm supposed to allow people to, if somebody slaps me, is it okay then? I'm just supposed to let them slap me again? Just let them take advantage of me was kind of the idea with that. And of course, the answer to Freddie's point is we have a right to defend ourselves. Defend ourselves, defend our family, defend our city, defend our country, kind of along those lines. This passage is about the Old Testament passages that Jesus is referring to. Remember, he's saying, and these things you have heard it said, or all these other things, they were originally intended from the law of Moses to promote just retribution. And then they were often prescribing an appropriate penalty for criminal conduct. And I was reading, some of the things I was reading was pointing out, also usually it was by some kind of almost judicial system, right? The leaders of the people who were making these decisions. And so what we're talking about is that we are not to retaliate and be the ones who say, well, it's my vengeance to take. I'm going to get my vengeance back. I'm going to, retaliate, to respond in kind.
Not 3 eyes for 1 eye or 4 teeth for 1 tooth, but a tooth for a tooth. Eye for eye, justice be served.
Yeah.
Because if you leave it up to man, then you're going to go a little bit further.
Yes.
You hit me once, I'm going to hit you twice, then he's going to hit me 3 times, I'm going to hit you 4.
Yeah. And on and on it goes. So the point is, we we don't retaliate in kind. And in fact, we do sometimes as Christians, we maybe even give up our own rights for others. Now, back to this question, I don't think we should allow others to take advantage of us. Now, the kind of, and as Ricky mentioned, we sometimes go to extremes, and I sometimes use extreme examples to try to make a point. I often use the word facetious, right? I'm being a little facetious about this. But, would you rather give your money to an addict, a drug addict, or to the cause of Christ, the service of God, back to the church? You say, well, why does it have to be a choice? Well, to the person who was asking this question, and we were having a good discussion, I don't mean that bad, but we were discussing it, somebody asks you for money, you give them $20, you find out they spend it to try to buy more drugs, they come back, are you supposed to say, well, they asked me again, I should just keep giving? And so when you say, well, should you keep giving your money to the addict, or should you, obviously keep some of it, or use it for you, or give it to the church? Well, it's kind of an extreme. We understand that. And of course, the other thing that Scripture does talk about, but I don't want us to get too deep into tonight, is boundaries. Boundaries in life are healthy. And I think they're scriptural even, that then if that person keeps coming back to you and asking for more money and almost trying to take advantage of you, that you try to form some type of boundary, and just say, well, I'll give you $20 this time, but this is the last time. I need you to know this is the last time, and I'm forming a boundary here. And we sometimes have to do that within our own families or within certain situations. We set up boundaries to protect ourselves, to protect our children, family members, others. And so I think that's perfectly normal to say that we have to use wisdom and discernment to try to judge a situation and say there's times in which I do not retaliate. I do not respond in kind. But it also doesn't mean I just allow someone to run over me. Freddie mentioned Paul in at least 3 times in the book of Acts. The Apostle Paul, under trial, under questioning, sort of stands up for himself, especially when it came to his Roman citizenship. And he would say, wait a minute, I have a right to stop this as a Roman citizen, and I'm going to stand up and not allow you just to beat me within a pulp or, an inch of my life or whatever. I'm going to stop this in a way and defend myself, not with a gun or a sword, but just simply, stating something that's true and not allowing them to keep running him over, kind of thing. So.
The sad thing is that the biblical concept of Christianity and that which was on display perfectly by Jesus is not that, for example, here's a wife who's is so influenced by Jesus that she keeps on forgiving her adulterous husband.
Yeah.
And he keeps on and on committing adultery. So, well, I just love him so much. No, you're aiding and abetting him after a little while.
Yeah.
You're assisting him in being a heathen, and you can't keep on doing that without being contributing to the delinquency of your own worthless husband. And
at that point, a healthy boundary would obviously be, seeking out help, saying, I'm moving out, or you've got to move out, or we've got to establish this boundary to change your behavior, hopefully, but, to at least change the situation, because as Freddie's saying, it's not, God would not want him to continue in sin, her to allow him to continue in sin and just act like I'm being loving. And of course, we could spend the rest of the night on that. So very quickly, let's go back to Ecclesiastes chapter 10. So Ecclesiastes chapter 10, and if we have time, we're going to get into the first part of chapter 11. One of the commentaries I was using called this a variety of proverbs and various gems of wisdom. So if you turn over to chapter 10, you might or might not notice that there are a lot of, this is almost like it turns into the book of Proverbs for just a minute. It's going to give you a lot of short statements, and we're going to try to examine a few of those tonight just for the sake of time. And then next week, come back and pick up in chapter 11 and study 11 and then 12 the last 2 weeks. So verses 1 through 7 talk a little bit about foolishness. Verse 1 says, dead flies putrefy the perfumer's ointment, say that 3 times real fast, and cause it to give off a foul odor, so does a little folly to one respected for wisdom and honor. A little foolishness can harm a reputation. And we think about that, and the idea here that dead flies can do something to the ointment, to the smell, and even it says there a little folly can bring us down and can kind of harm what we're trying to do as Christians. Look at verses 2 and 3. A wise man's heart is at his right hand, but a fool's heart at his left. I'm sorry to all you left-handed people that are in here tonight, but that is a mention to, a lot of people are right-handed, still kind of that way. The right hand of God, the right hand of the throne was kind of considered to be second there. So that is this idea here that a wise man is at his right hand and the fool's heart at his left. But notice verse 3. Even when a fool walks along the way, he lacks wisdom, and he shows everyone that he is a fool. I wrote down next to my notes here what's here under this first bullet point or first point. Our actions show our true self. And this is back to what we've been saying even on Sunday morning. As you think in your heart, so are you. Your actions are going to eventually come out of your heart. And so the same thing here. A fool shows everyone that he is a fool. We judge people by their actions. Sometimes we want to give people a pass and say, people say, well, that person is this or that. And you want to say, oh, no, we try to give them the benefit of the doubt, but sometimes it's hard to overcome somebody's reputation, somebody's history. Sometimes they always show themselves to be a fool. At the ball game, on Friday night, in the gym, at the store, wherever they might be, they show themselves to be a fool. And so our actions do show our true self. Again, a New Testament concept, Matthew chapter 5, but also the writer of Ecclesiastes, the teacher, is saying this as well. And then I like the way that it was said there in verses 5 through 7. The teacher says, there is an evil I have seen under the sun, as an error proceeding from the ruler. Folly is set in great dignity, while the rich sit in a lowly place. I have seen servants on horses, while princes walk on the ground like servants. And so I like the way that this commentary I was using said that it is often the case that foolish people are elevated to places of power. Now, again, we'll try not to get into too many politics tonight, but that's the way we feel about a lot of those things. Foolish people in power, and I like the way it was said there, folly rides while wisdom walks. That's the way life seems to go sometimes. That's exactly what the teacher is saying here. Those who are foolish have been elevated and are riding where the princes should be, and the princes are the one walking as the servants should be. And so when we think about that, that's often the case in life. Even as we've talked about these words last week, life is frustrating. We talked about that things are difficult, things are not always the way they should be. Well, here's a short few proverbial statements, proverbs, that kind of carry along with this idea here about foolishness. Verses 8 through 10. He who digs a pit will fall into it, and whoever, you hear the Proverbs in it, right? If you've been in one of Freddie's Proverbs class or watched him on television there and heard him walking and talking through Proverbs, it sounds just like it. He who digs a pit will fall into it, and whoever breaks through a wall, your version may have something along the lines more of a bush or something like that. Whoever breaks through a wall will be bitten by a serpent. He who quarries stones may be hurt by them, and he who splits wood may be endangered by it. The idea here is that you reap what you sow. Of course, from Galatians chapter 6, verses 7 and 8 as well. You reap what you sow. Time, a story as old as time, as we say. In the New Testament, in the Old Testament, that is true. And then even in verse 10, if the axe is dull, this may be the same axe that's splitting the wood there at the end of verse 9. If the axe is dull and one does not sharpen the edge, then he must use more strength, but wisdom brings success. How many of you have heard the old saying there, work smarter, not harder, right? It says when the axe is dull, the person has to start swinging harder, use more energy. Maybe use a little wisdom in your work, use a little wisdom in what you're doing. Stop. Sharpen the blade, and then you can go back to working at the same clip that you were, producing the same amount that you were. And so just this idea of using wisdom in the things that we do. Let me get through one more here, and we can take any thoughts you have so far. Verses 11 through 15. A serpent may bite when it is not charmed. The babbler is no different. My version has a note that says the master of the tongue is no different. The words of a wise man's mouth are gracious, but the lips of a fool shall swallow him up. The words of his mouth begin with foolishness, and the end of his talk is raving madness. A fool also multiplies words. No man knows what is to be. Who can tell him what will be after him? The labor of fools wearies them, for they do not even know how to go to the city. Of course, this is an allusion to the idea of snake charming, right? Just a little bit here that people would practice. A serpent may bite when it is not charmed. A snake doesn't have to be charmed or a snake does not have to be charmed before it will bite someone. And as a snake will bite without being encouraged, so will a babbler, is the New King James word there. A babbler will attack when there is no cause. I have on the screen here, a fool will talk with a multitude of words. And that foolish babbler begins with foolishness and ends up, as it says there in verse 13 at the end, in mischievous madness, in raving madness. He talks himself into many foolish situations where he injures innocent people and himself. Won't ask you to name names, won't ask you to raise your hand, but we've all known somebody like that. They just can't stop talking. They just keep saying things, and before you know it, they've gone too far. They've crossed that line. They've hurt somebody's feelings. And so a fool will talk with a multitude of words about any subject, but he knows as little about any given subject as anyone else knows about the future. That's the question there in verse number 14. Who can tell him what will be after him? He doesn't know the future, but he's going to keep talking like he does, and his ignorance is as unlimited as his willingness to talk. His ignorance is illustrated by the fact that he does not even know how to get into the city, as it says in verse 15 there. And so, we use that word sometimes, fool. Maybe not as popular as it once was, but people who are foolish with their words. We understand the concept of babbler, certainly there. Comments or questions about any of this, that in particular, or anything we've just mentioned from the previous verses?
This is absolutely just like the proverb.
Yeah.
Pithy little statements that are absolutely true and sometimes comical as well.
Sure. Yeah. And the illustrations, again, I know Freddie knows and from his teaching at both at Greens Lake Road there and the television program, but the illustrations that we don't understand as well. For instance, verse 1 there, the dead flies that putrefy the perfumers, I can't even say it again, ointment, right? We don't have that the same way necessarily, but if I've killed one fly in my kitchen in the last week, I've killed 400, it's felt like, because it's still hot and they still come flying in when the door's open and I'm yelling at kids to shut the door, right? And then what they do, they find the food. They want to find the food to hang around, and it will cause it to be bad or to cause it eventually to have a foul odor maybe. And so all these things are illustrations that we can understand. And as I mentioned here, especially in verses 11 through 15, people that we know, people that we interact with, maybe even people that we've been a time or two when we've been someone who tends to talk too much, tends to find ourselves not being gracious with our words, but destroying others and even destroying ourselves. And even people that we think are our enemies, we'll make enemies of because we talk too much in those kinds of ways. All right, then verses 18 through 20. Verses 18 through 20. I kind of skipped over 16 and 17 just for the purpose of time and that kind of thing. It's talking about the kings and the countries there in that section. If you look down at it, you're still open to that section. But a country is blessed which has a son of nobles as its king, as opposed to maybe a child for a king. Again, we don't allow children to rule or to be senators or president or anything like that, but we sometimes feel as if people in those positions are acting like children. But certainly that is a little bit of a play on words there, a thought about that. Israel was blessed by King Josiah, right, who came to the throne when he was only 8 years old, 2 Kings chapter 22. So it's not in of itself a blanket statement, but we understand the concept that most 8-year-olds are not ready to rule. And if you've got a child who's reigning as king, and, maybe just a little digression here, but that seems to be the way that a lot of families work today, right? The 8-year-old is ruling as king, or the 4-year-old is ruling as king and ruling the family. And the point here, of course, is that woe to the land, woe to the people who have a child for a king, but a blessing on another land whose king is the son of nobles. In fact, it mentions there the illustration in this case is your princes feast at the proper time for strength and not for drunkenness. What does it say in verse 16? That the child king would feast in the morning, almost as if that's the first priority. I'm going to get to the feasting in the morning. I'm going to get to the revelry, the drunkenness in the morning, and spend my first hours and first time, the most of my time on those kinds of things, and not, spending the morning maybe getting the work accomplished, ruling the city, doing those things, and then, doing the eating later. That's the difference in these two groups.
If a kid or a foolish person, either one, had their
Yeah.
That's why you don't let a kid shoot away from eating breakfast.
Yeah. Closest we come to our house is chocolate chips and the pancakes, but that's not a chocolate cake for breakfast. But no, but yeah, if I let my kids eat chocolate cake, they probably would, or at least maybe Gail's cupcakes would for sure be in that line. They'd time for breakfast. But that's kind of, as Freddie mentioned, kind of a silly way, but certainly the way that people act, the way that people behave. All right, so verse 18. This is a little more maybe something for us to really chew on and think about. Because of laziness, the building decays, and through idleness of hands, the house leaks. A feast is made for laughter, and wine makes merry, but money answers everything. Keep that in mind. Verse 20 to finish out this part of the chapter, or this chapter. Do not curse the king even in your thought. Do not curse the rich even in your bedroom. For a bird of the air may carry your voice, and a bird in flight may tell the matter. All right, so we're going to break these down into actually 3 sections, each verse. Number 1, verse 18, the subject of slothfulness, the subject of laziness. It's a problem for some people. Problem maybe not so much in our world today in the sense that it's something new we're dealing with, but something that a lot of people struggle with. And he mentions here that buildings, houses, even cars, all kinds of things fall into disrepair due to laziness. But here's the interesting thing to think about when it comes to that. The same thing is true for our talents or our skills, our abilities. We have a saying that says it's like riding a bike. Well, the implication is that you never forget how to ride a bike. You can always get right back on. But some of you can attest to the fact that when you've not done something for a while, you lose that skill. You lose that ability. I've been talking with Nick a lot about, Nick has gone to work, some of you know, where I worked for about 13 years in Chattanooga there. And it's funny, I even went back to the plant to visit him a few weeks ago when someone was retiring, and Nick kind of walked me around the plant. And, I had a few moments of going, man, I spent 13 years in this place, and I've forgotten all kinds of stuff. If they handed me an order and said, here, can you go put this order in the system and figure out what to do? I probably can't. I've lost that skill because I quit using it, and I quit working in that capacity. It's perfectly fine and normal, nothing wrong with it, but how often is that the case with us? Some things are like riding a bike. Other things, if you don't practice at it, you forget it. What about our muscles, right? You just, you keep your muscles, or you got to keep lifting weights or keep exercising. What about our minds? Just our mind, period. The idea that, some people may have a tendency, or I know they're still studying Alzheimer's and dementia and these kinds of things, and maybe there's something that inherently, but for some people, they say, work your mind, keep your mind active, doing puzzles or things, and work your mind, and then maybe you won't have any of that atrophy as you get older as a possibility. And of course, while he doesn't say it here directly, and this isn't a New Testament passage, what about your spiritual muscles? How often do we forget to read and forget to pray, and we neglect those things to the point where then we are weak in those ways? I have a lesson, I don't think I've done it here in the last year and a half. I know that I did it at Saudi because I first did it here probably many years ago, 15 or 16 years ago, about the idea of, what would you look like? What would your body look like if your body looked like your spiritual health? I mean, just simple concept. You probably heard it in other lessons before, but, would you be like a strong person? Would you be a bodybuilder? Or and of course, the kind of uncomfortable, even silly but uncomfortable idea is, what if we had some kind of scanner, or some kind of glasses that we put on and you could see everybody in that kind of way? Would you be healthy and fit, or would you be, not healthy?
John,
3 John verse 2. That's it.
He says he wished that he hoped, or he desired for guests to be just as healthy physically, just as healthy spiritually, physically as well as spiritually.
Yes. That's where my lesson came from. So in 3 John 2, that you be in health in all things as your soul prospers is the idea there. So so we got to avoid slothfulness. And certainly laziness and slothfulness was a problem then, problem now, and something we have to fight against. All right, then I mentioned to you to keep in your mind verse 19. Verse 19 says, money answers everything. The truth is that money viewed properly is a great advantage. It can be a great advantage for us. It's money in and of itself is not sinful. I know you know that. We talked about it earlier this year. While at the same time, loving money is severely denounced in Scripture. But money answers everything is carrying with the idea that it can be of good to us. It can cause things, cause us to be able to do things. Sometimes you have a missionary that comes in and talks about a good work, and you want to say, I wish I had a little extra money to give. I wish I was a millionaire, and I would be able to give, more to that. Now, as we talked about with our stewardship, there's a sense in which, we've got to hurt till it gives, or give till it hurts, and we got to try to, do what we can, even when we're not millionaires. But that is a challenge for us. And then verse 20, look at this real quick. There seems to be a warning against cursing the king and the rich. I don't know if that's exactly what's being said here, so much that we know that we need to offer them respect and be obedient. That's New Testament encouragement as well, is be respectful. We certainly want to pray for our leaders. But here's the secondary thing I took out of this, and you notice there in the second part of the verse, but don't do things in private that you don't want getting out. Sometimes we're shocked when we say something to somebody and then about someone else, and then we're with that somebody else and they mention it, and you're like, well, wait a minute, I said that in the privacy of my house or privacy of a different conversation. Well, if you said it out loud, there's always a chance it can be overheard. I was getting there, but yeah, I don't know for sure if you ever do a history of words, and especially when you're using the internet, we know that you can trust everything on the internet. Not actually, but there's some allusion to the fact that this may be where a little bird told me came from. There are some, when people start doing the history of these things, I don't know if there's a bias against the Bible, but there is like allusions to the same thing in plays, Shakespearean plays or things like that, certain poems, poetry that use the same idea. So people say, well, that's where it came from. But maybe, just maybe, a little bird told me was kind of, carried with it here in the English Standard Version, the King James for sure, and then the New King James all kind of have this, allude to this a little bit. So very interesting to think about. But yeah, but be careful what you say. Be careful what you say. I always tell the story that one time when I was at Freed-Hardeman as a freshman, somebody was walking by that I knew, and they were, I don't know if they were as far as me to Brian here across the way out in this open area, but I kind of yelled something, kind of being silly, but maybe being a little bit mean, about somebody else. And next thing I know, I turned around and there they were, standing there. And those things happen to us, right? Sometimes we say something like, oh, didn't know you were standing there. Well, the truth is, if we didn't want it heard, we probably shouldn't have said it in the first place, right? That's the difficult side of that. Now, sometimes we're being a little silly or whatever, but sometimes there's a little truth behind it, and we think we're saying it in private. And it says here, do not curse the rich even in your bedroom, because you'll find out that a little bird will tell on you, is certainly the concept here. So very quickly, we're going to look at the first 6 verses of chapter 11. Each one of these is kind of separate and different, but there's kind of a theme in this as well. And so verse 1 talks about it kind of alludes to the practice of spreading seed at the water's edge. In fact, there's a passage in Isaiah 32 that says, blessed are ye that sow beside all waters, that send forth thither the feet of the ox and the ass. And so apparently ancient farmers at times would sow their seed in shallow water or on the mud as the waters would recede, and then they would take the livestock over, that's what Isaiah is referring to, and have the livestock to bury the seed in the earth by walking on it, and then those crops would come forth. In fact, the Egyptians have said to have spread their seed on the Nile River as the floodwaters and would spread it out over the land, and as the waters receded, the seed was deposited in the soil, and then the resulting crops were, of course, renowned, especially as we think about Egypt. So the point seems to be that though it could appear that the farmer was wasting his seed by sowing it on and near the water in due season, there would be a harvest. And of course, the same thing is true with our spiritual seed in this life. No harvest may be immediately coming about, but there could be a full crop that will be reaped because of that. So verse 2, were you going to say something, Brady? Sorry. Okay. Verse 2 continues the thought introduced in verse 1 about giving. And that's why I have on the screen here, giving a portion of one's bounty to those in need may pay dividends in days to come. Right? Giving to 7 and also to 8, for you do not know what evil will be on the earth. And so if we share with 7 or 8 others, it may be in the future we will find ourselves in their position and they're able to help us. And we don't do it for that reason. We don't do it, we don't know what the future holds. But yes, especially as we think about our church family, as we're able to help others, then there's a great opportunity that could come back to it. God's child, even verse 3. This statement fits the same theme. The clouds fill up with rain, but they do not keep this earth-sustaining moisture. Rather, they open their floodgates and dispense rain without partiality upon the earth for the benefit of all. And so God's child must cultivate an attitude of giving. Material wealth we try to keep for ourselves for selfish purposes, we ultimately lose it anyway. So why not use it to be helpful, to give to those who are in need? And even the second clause, look at verse 3 again. The second clause of this verse teaches an excellent lesson. What does it say? A tree will fall in the direction it leans in life, and after it falls, it cannot change the location where it came to rest. And thus, if we have a selfish bent in life and do not aid the needy, after death, we cannot change. That's just the way that it is. So verse 4, we're quickly running out of time. Verse 4, Solomon teaches a lesson on taking advantage of opportunities and trusting God to see the outcome. As we think about a farmer who spends too much time sometimes observing the weather, he may be too fearful to even plant his crop. He's too worried about it. He may not even have a harvest. He must use his time wisely and use the opportunity to plant, leaving the unforeseen to God in whose way he walks. And so when we think about this, helping others, we need to be able to do that and do that at the time, not be so caught up in these other things. As we have opportunity to do good to the needy, to worship God, to teach the lost, to help the weak, to restore the erring, let us do it now and trust God that there will be something good to come out of that. And it may be a time that we can't exactly see or know, but it's something that we definitely need to keep in mind. So trust in God. And then verses 5 and 6 talk about this idea of working. Verse 5, we cannot know the way of the wind or the way of the Spirit, maybe the version that you have in front of you there. We do not comprehend how the baby develops in its mother, as it even talks about that idea, how the bones grow in the womb of her who is with child in verse 5. There are many other mysteries in the world around us that we can't understand or explain, but it is God who has designed these systems by which babies are conceived and developed and born. And so, what we've discovered, just rattle your brain, right? What we've discovered is only the hem of the garment, as we say, to what God has done and the way that he has set things in motion. And of course, we even think about that as we go to back in history and think about, things that have been discovered since then. Actually had Clayton call me, I guess it was last night maybe, or the other night before, and ask me just a totally random question about science in the Bible lesson I had done before, and about doctors in Europe who were touching dead bodies and then going to touch expectant mothers, and the mothers kept dying. They couldn't figure it out. And we say, you were touching dead bodies, you didn't wash your hand, and you went and examined the mother. What did you expect to happen? They weren't washing their hands. I mean, I forget what year that was, but it was not that long ago, especially considering what we think about in time. And they weren't figuring out to wash their hands after they examined a dead body. So when we think about the way God has set things in motion, it really will rattle our brain. Then very quickly, verse 6, Solomon instructs us to use our hands in the morning and evening. That is, to be diligent. I have on the screen here simply work. Be diligent, be active, be zealous in doing God's service, doing our duty. There is much to do, and there is little time in which to get it done. I wanted to share this story that came with the notes I've been using, but it says, an unbelieving farmer in a certain community boastfully asserted to his Bible-believing neighbor that God does not give Christians any special benefit. He claimed that he never prayed, he never attended church services, he did not believe in the Bible, didn't believe in God, yet he said, my crops are just as bountiful as yours, the Christian, Bible-believing neighbor. You pray, you worship, you study the Bible, and my fields still produce just as much as yours. And the Christian neighbor observed, however, God does not pay out his full reward in October. Oh, something to you to think about there. We know we're looking for a reward that goes beyond just when the crop rises out of the ground. And so we've got to keep working. One more time here, of course, is our question we've been asking all along through all of this. And that was only a little bit of a divergence there because, as we mentioned, a lot of proverbial short, pithy statements. We'll come back next week and talk about the rest of chapter 11 and then get into chapter 12 the following week. And then this quarter, speaking of Ecclesiastes and time, is already about done. Hard to believe. We'll move on after that. So appreciate your comments and attention tonight.